Husband wanted threesome for his birthday. My husband's 30th birthday was approaching, and I was excited to surprise him. Over the years, birthdays had always been a big deal in our relationship. We'd do the usual gift-giving, plan fun little parties or weekend trips, and spend time indulging in each other's company. He'd drop occasional hints in the months leading up to his birthday. Maybe an offhand comment about a restaurant he'd like to visit or a new gadget he was eyeing. But this year, I noticed something was different about him. He wasn't making the usual casual remarks about what he wanted, and I had to admit, I was curious. I finally asked him, flat out, "Okay, your big 3-0 is coming up. Is there anything specific you'd like for your birthday?" He looked at me for a moment with an intensity that caught me off guard, then leaned in close and lowered his voice. "Would you be open to a threesome?" I remember blinking at him, my heart skipping a beat. Of all the things he could have asked for, like that watch he'd been eyeing last year, or maybe a fancy dinner at that new sushi spot in town, he'd decided to ask for a threesome. I was so stunned I couldn't even form a coherent response. My immediate reaction was a chaotic swirl of surprise, discomfort, curiosity, and yes, I'll admit it, a pinch of excitement. After all, we'd never done anything like that before. Our sex life was pretty good, at least from my perspective. I'd never felt like we needed to spice things up, but obviously, he did. He must have seen the unsettled look on my face, because he launched into immediate damage control. "Hey, it's not that you're not enough for me," he said. "Please don't think that. I've just always been curious about it. I know it might be a lot to ask, but I can't help thinking it could really take things to another level. If it makes you uncomfortable, I totally understand. This should be about both of us. I love you, and if you say no, that's okay too." I couldn't even muster a response right then. I just nodded and told him I'd think about it. He seemed content to give me that space, probably relieved he hadn't gotten an outright rejection on the spot. Over the next couple of days, I wrestled with his request. I went back and forth in my head. Would I be opening a can of worms by agreeing to this? Was he secretly dissatisfied with our sex life? Why now? Didn't he realize that once we crossed that line, there was no going back? Or maybe, just maybe, it could actually be a fun, exciting experience. I was by no means prudish, but a threesome with my husband felt like a step that needed very serious consideration. I even ended up confiding in my sister, which is not something I do lightly when it comes to intimate details of my marriage. But we're close, and I needed some form of outside perspective. She told me that if I was comfortable, and if I thought it might bring us closer, or at least grant him some fantasy fulfillment, there was nothing inherently wrong with trying it at least once. "It's your marriage," she said. "You two set the rules. Just make sure your boundaries are crystal clear. If you decide it's not for you, don't feel pressured to continue in." That helped a bit, and I mulled it over for another day or so, then finally sat him down. "I've thought about it," I said. "Let's try it once, see how it goes." I expected him to be happy, but the sheer excitement, practically childlike glee, that lit up his face took me by surprise. He started talking a mile a minute, about the person he had in mind, about how he'd handle all the details. That last bit hit me like a slap across the face, though I kept my expression neutral. He had someone in mind. That quickly, that easily. I tried to stay calm, telling myself he was probably just daydreaming, or possibly fantasizing about a friend or something. But my gut instinct flickered with alarm. Was there something going on behind my back already? I tried to brush it off. Maybe he'd just put a lot of thought into it and was excited about the possibility. I decided to give him the benefit of the doubt. He was my husband, after all, and we'd built our marriage on trust, or so I believed at the time. He set it up for the following Saturday night. The woman's name was Jenny. The first thing I noticed when I met her was that she bore a striking resemblance to me. It was uncanny. Same height, similar figure, similar hair color. Even the shape of her eyes reminded me of mine. Part of me felt flattered. Another part felt deeply weirded out. If she was a random stranger who resembled me so closely, that was an odd coincidence. But if my husband had chosen her explicitly because of that similarity, well, that was an entire psychological can of worms I didn't want to open just yet. We met at a local cafe for a brief introduction. She seemed pleasant enough, soft-spoken, polite, and clearly interested in the possibility of hooking up with us. My husband was almost too eager, but I tried to maintain composure so I wouldn't look like I was second-guessing. The three of us chatted about benign stuff, our jobs, our hobbies, our backgrounds. I still couldn't shake the feeling that she was basically a version of me. Though, after coffee, we said our goodbyes, and she agreed to come over on Saturday night. For the rest of the week, my stomach was in knots. I spent a lot of time reading online forums about threesomes, people's experiences, horror stories, success stories. Some said it was the best thing they'd ever done, while others said it ended their relationships. My conclusion: this could either bond my husband and me more tightly or crack our marriage wide open. When Saturday night arrived, I bought a nice bottle of wine, put on lingerie that I knew my husband liked, and tried to get into a headspace that was open and maybe even a bit adventurous. He was equally prepared. Dimmed lights in the bedroom, scented candles, fresh sheets on the bed. Jenny arrived promptly, dressed in a simple black dress. She was holding a bottle of wine, too. Sweet red, which my husband likes. We spent a good half hour in the living room, awkwardly chatting and sipping wine. The mood felt half friendly, half tense. My heart was hammering. Eventually, though, we made our way to the bedroom, and I tried to loosen up as best I could. I'll admit, once things got going, it wasn't the worst experience. A bit nerve-wracking, yes, but he paid enough attention to me that I didn't feel neglected, and Jenny was respectful of the boundaries I'd laid out. By the time it ended, all three of us were breathless and sweaty, and I had a strange mix of relief and disorientation swirling in my head. The next morning, Jenny said goodbye and left. My husband pulled me into a tight hug and asked how I felt. I told him it was okay, but I wasn't dying to do it again. He seemed to accept that answer, or so I thought. A few days went by, and suddenly he was pestering me. When could we invite Jenny over again? Didn't I think it had been fun? Didn't I enjoy the feeling of being desired by two people at once? Initially, I just reminded him that we'd agreed it would be a one-time deal. But he persisted. Come on, you said it was okay. I know you liked it, even if you don't want to admit it. Just one more time, please. His insistence was off-putting, to say the least. It felt like he was trying to manipulate me with guilt, and it got worse each day. Around the same time, I realized that a small section of my hair in the back looked like it had been roughly cut, like someone had taken scissors to it while I slept or something. I also couldn't find a locket that I wore almost all the time. It was a family heirloom, and I was certain I'd worn it before Jenny came over. Now it was nowhere to be found. I wanted to chalk it up to absent-mindedness. Maybe I misplaced the locket, and maybe I'd accidentally snagged my hair in something, and it had broken off. Still, a nagging voice in the back of my head told me there was something weird going on. Not long after, we ran into Jenny at the grocery store. She waved enthusiastically, making a beeline for US. My husband grinned from ear to ear, and I tried to force a polite smile. She asked how we'd been and made a flirty joke about our fun night. My husband, without so much as glancing at me for confirmation, said something like, "We've been great. Maybe we could do it again soon." I nearly lost my composure right there in aisle 6. When we left, I hissed at him. What the hell was that? We haven't even talked about it. He just shrugged, saying, "I thought we had fun. I just assumed you'd be open to it." The way he said it, dismissive, like my feelings didn't matter, made my stomach clench with anger. After a few tense days of arguing, I reluctantly agreed to a second get-together, hoping that might be enough to satiate his newfound obsession. The second time was also relatively smooth in a strictly physical sense. The boundaries were respected, and we had an okay time. But I felt uneasy the whole night, almost like I was watching a show from the outside. My husband's face was too eager, too fixated on Jenny. He kept checking to see if I was noticing how into her he was, or maybe that was my imagination. In any case, I felt more like a spectator than a participant. When it was done, I felt exhausted and strangely hollow. In the weeks that followed, we seemed to run into Jenny more often. Once, we saw her leaving a salon. When she turned around, my breath caught in my throat. Her hair was now the exact same shade as mine, styled almost identically. Another time I noticed that her lips seemed plumper, more like mine in shape. It was downright eerie. I mentioned it to my husband, who just laughed it off. "She probably likes your look. You're gorgeous." Take it as a compliment, but it didn't feel like a compliment. It felt like a single white female scenario. She was gradually transforming herself to look exactly like me. Most unsettling was the look in my husband's eyes whenever he glanced at her in those moments. He didn't look disturbed. He looked pleased. Then came the day that changed everything. I was out running errands when I spotted Jenny on a busy street. She was wearing a tight shirt and jeans that looked like she could have fished them right out of my closet. I started to cross the road to say hi, but then I saw my husband approaching her. He walked right up, wrapped an arm around her waist, and gave her a quick kiss. My heart stopped. It wasn't a friendly peck on the cheek. It was something more intimate. I thought maybe I'd faint, The adrenaline hit me so hard that my hands started shaking. I ducked behind a parked car, not wanting them to spot me. That's when I overheard snippets of their conversation. Everything's going according to plan. Wine worked perfectly. More samples later, you already got the hair and the locket. Samples, wine, locket. My blood turned to ice. I felt sick to my stomach. This wasn't just an affair. This was something else. Something far more twisted. Eventually, they parted ways. I stayed hidden until I could collect myself. Then I drove home. My mind was racing, trying to parse out the meaning of what I'd heard. Wine, hair, locket, samples. For what? Was this some bizarre experiment or a cult thing? I didn't know what to think. But I did know that my husband had gone from a bit of a thrill-seeker in the bedroom to something borderline sinister. He came home that night, acting like nothing was amiss. I wanted to confront him, but I decided to wait, to see if I could gather more information. Something told me that tipping him off now could be dangerous, especially if he was dabbling in something I couldn't understand. Soon after, he suggested we invite Jenny over again, maybe for dinner and fun. I had zero desire to go through with this charade, but curiosity and a sense of self-preservation won out. I told him yes. My plan was to observe everything closely, maybe pretend to drink the wine but not actually consume it, in case there was something in IT. He'd mentioned the wine in that weird conversation, and it wouldn't hurt to be cautious. The night arrived. Jenny came over and we had dinner. There was wine, of course. I pretended to drink, but I slyly poured most of mine into a nearby houseplant when nobody was looking. Conversation was stilted at first, but eventually we moved to the bedroom. My husband seemed more into her than usual, which both hurt my feelings and fueled my suspicion. I tried to go through the motions, but my focus was on playing detective. When it was over, I feigned exhaustion and drifted off, or so they thought. I lay still in the darkness, listening. That's when I felt it. A soft tug at my hair, then a gentle swab on my arm, like he was wiping something off my skin. My heart pounded, but I forced myself not to move. I heard him pad softly out of the room, presumably with Jenny in tow. I tiptoed after them as quietly as I could. They went into the kitchen, and from the dark hallway I could make out only fragments of their conversation. The process. We have enough of her DNA. The metamorphosis should be nearly ready. Once it's complete, we won't need the original. The words twisted my stomach into knots. DNA, metamorphosis. They were planning something horrific involving me. My hair, my skin samples, that missing locket. My mind flashed to the many nights I could have been sleeping while they took more from me. Samples, as they called it. For what? Some kind of twisted science experiment. Or was it witchcraft? It sounded too insane to be real, but there it was, happening in my own home. I slipped back into the bedroom and lay down, trembling with fear and rage. I had never felt more violated. My husband, my partner, was plotting something vile with this Jenny woman, and I needed answers. Yet my instincts told me to lay low until I understood more. The next day, while my husband was at work, I decided to thoroughly search his office. We'd always respected each other's privacy, but I sure as hell wasn't going to let that stop me now. After rummaging through drawers, filing cabinets, and stacks of papers, I noticed a hidden compartment under one of his desk drawers. It took some prying, but eventually I opened it. Inside was a small, leather-bound book titled How to Make the Perfect Wife. My stomach lurched at the sight. Flipping it open with shaking hands, I found diagrams, anatomical sketches, alchemical recipes, weird incantations. There were pages about collecting DNA samples, using them in potions, orchestrating that transference process. It was all about refining the flaws out of one's current spouse to create an improved version, an ideal partner. The text read like something out of a twisted Victorian monster-making manual. My eyes skimmed lines like, the hair, nails, and precious objects, imbued with personal resonance, create the basis for spiritual tethering. The subject must be kept in the dark. Excessive stress or panic can contaminate the purity of the sample. The final metamorphosis merges the newly formed entity with the original's life essence, rendering the original obsolete. I practically threw the book down. Obsolete. My husband was planning to replace me with some better version of me, someone who would presumably worship him, do his bidding, Never argue, never say no. And I wasn't sure if obsolete meant death or something equally horrible. Any lingering love or trust I felt for him was incinerated in that moment. There was only rage, fear, and a burning desire for retribution. My mother's voice echoed in my head. Don't get mad, get even. She was always telling my sisters and me to stand up for ourselves, that a man who mistreated you didn't deserve your tears. He deserved your wrath. I'd never felt that so strongly before. I realized I needed a plan, and I needed it quickly, before they tried to complete this monstrous ritual. Over the next few days, I tiptoed around him, acting sweet and oblivious. I pretended everything was normal, even indulging him in flirtatious conversation about inviting Jenny over again. I cooked his favorite meals, smiled at his jokes, laughed when he teased me. All the while, my mind was working nonstop. I read more of the dreaded book, carefully taking notes. I needed to understand the method so I could sabotage it. Apparently, the final step required a large amount of my DNA, hair, skin, bodily fluids, to be mingled with a substance that the better version drank, initiating the metamorphosis. The result would be someone who was physically me but altered in all the ways he wanted. In that process, the original me would supposedly be destroyed or drained or something horrifying. The text was hazy, but it didn't sound like I'd survive. But I also learned something else. The entire process hinged on whose DNA was used. If the formula was altered, the metamorphosis could take an entirely different form. One that was unpredictable, potentially lethal to the summoner. That was my golden ticket. If I could trick them into drinking the wrong concoction, I might turn the tables. I didn't understand the details, whether this was science, magic, or both. But I was determined to meddle. I concocted a ruse of my own. Gather enough of my husband's DNA, hair, skin, etc., and slip it into the final mixture in place of my own. Then, if the ritual worked the way the book described, Jenny would morph into a perfect version of my husband, not me. And maybe that perfect version would despise him, or maybe it would be mindless, or maybe it'd do exactly what I ended up commanding it to do. The book was maddeningly vague about the possibilities, but that was fine by me. I just needed to backfire on him. The day arrived when my husband suggested another gathering. By now, Jenny's transformation was nearly complete. She looked so much like me that it was eerie. Her laugh, her posture, even her facial expressions mimicked mine. But there was a coldness in her eyes, a robotic undertone in her voice that was distinctly not me. I couldn't wait for him to see how twisted his little plan had become. I prepared everything. I secretly collected hairs from his hairbrush, swabs from his toothbrush, and nail clippings I found in the trash. Gross, I know, but desperate times. Then I carefully brewed a special batch of wine, courtesy of the instructions I'd pieced together from the forbidden text. Into this wine, I added the DNA samples. His, not mine. I also added a few herbs recommended by the book that supposedly would finalize the metamorphosis. If he or Jenny suspected a thing, they didn't show it. That evening, Jenny arrived at our house with a predatory grin. My husband, practically salivating, wasted no time guiding her inside. I followed with forced enthusiasm. He popped open a bottle of wine, the one I had prepared, and poured us each a glass. We made small talk, dancing around the obvious, before eventually heading to the bedroom. I suspected he'd drug my wine as before, but this time, I replaced both mine and Jenny's glasses with the ones containing his DNA-laced mixture. Through a bit of cunning sleight of hand, I made sure the glass he drank from was normal, so he wouldn't ingest any suspicious liquid. He needed to be conscious to see the final spectacle. Inside the bedroom, tension crackled in the air. Lights dimmed, candles flickered, and the three of us began to undress. I felt revulsion at the thought of touching him, but I played along, letting him think everything was normally. Jenny kissed me once, which I allowed, but I mostly let them focus on each other while I sipped the doctored wine, knowing full well that it was actually infused with his DNA. She drank it too, her eyes never leaving me. It was surreal, going through the motions of intimacy while my mind roared with a single goal. Outsmart them. I had to remind myself to act the part, moaning softly, pretending to enjoy it, letting them think they were in control. In reality, I was hyper-aware of every move, every detail of the plan. Eventually, we all collapsed onto the bed. I knew from the instructions in the book that the final step typically occurred after the energy of the act had peaked, some bizarre fusion of physical and metaphysical. So I lay there, eyes half closed, feigning exhaustion. Then I felt it. He was tying my wrists to the bed. Jenny helped him, her expression strangely vacant. My pulse quickened. This was the part where they planned to finish me off and complete the metamorphosis. I struggled feebly so as not to arouse suspicion. He leaned over me, brushing my hair aside. "I'm sorry, dear," he said, voice laced with mock regret, "but this just isn't working out." I stared into his eyes, fighting the urge to scream. Instead, I forced a trembling smile, letting him believe I was helpless. "It's not me, it's you," he went on. "But don't worry. Soon I'll have a better you." Anger flared in me, but I remained silent. He then turned to Jenny, who was standing off to the side, her expression blank and waiting. He pulled out a small vial from the bedside table. "Drink this, my love. The final potion," he said to her. "The transformation will be complete." She tilted her head, eyes flicking to me for a moment. Then she took the vial and gulped it down. My husband's grin stretched wide in gleeful anticipation. I watched, heart pounding, as she began to tremble. Her body contorted slightly, as if something was snaking its way through her muscles. Her eyes rolled back, she let out a strangled moan, and for a moment she seemed on the brink of passing out. And then it started. Her features began to shift, though not into mine. Her hair receded into a shorter style, changing color. Her jaw broadened, her body shape morphed. Her curves vanished, replaced by the outline of a man's physique. She was turning into him, my husband's twin, or maybe an improved version of him. I couldn't tell which. He watched in horror. What's happening?" he stammered, stumbling backwards. "No, this isn't right." I could see pure panic contort his features. He turned to look at me, eyes wild with betrayal. "You did something," he snarled. I felt a surge of triumphant rage. "Surprised, dear?" I asked, spitting the last word like venom. "Yes, I discovered your ruse. And yes, I changed your precious recipe. Instead of my DNA, you fed her yours." At that moment, the newly transformed figure stood upright. Gone was Jenny. In her place stood a perfect mirror image of my husband. But there was something off about it. A cold, calculating presence in the eyes. "Surprised, dear?" The figure said it in a voice that echoed my husband's but was laced with a sinister undertone. "Would it surprise you to learn that the last batch was filled with your DNA? Not mine." It was parroting my lines, twisting them. The entity gave a cruel laugh, its gaze flicking between me and my now terrified husband. I had planned to command the new creature, but something in its presence made me realize it had its own agency. Perhaps it had gleaned something from both me and him. I was still tied up, but I mustered all my will and glared at the new creature. "Kill him," I said, hoping it might respond to me. For an agonizing second, it seemed to consider then it nodded. The next moments were a blur. My husband tried to flee the room, screaming, but the creature lunged. There was a sickening thud and the sound of breaking bones. Blood sprayed across the walls. He barely had time to let out a final cry before the creature tore into him with inhuman strength. I shut my eyes, overwhelmed by the brutality but also pulsing with relief. He was gone. He wouldn't hurt me anymore. He wouldn't replace me. He wouldn't do any of the twisted things he had planned. When I opened my eyes, the room was silent. My husband's remains lay crumpled on the floor. I turned my gaze to the creature. It was staring at me, chest heaving. For a terrifying second, I thought it might come for me next, but instead it moved closer, took in the sight of me tied up on the bed, and then carefully untied the restraints. I sat up, rubbing my wrists, watching it warily. I'm sorry you had to see that," it murmured, still using a voice almost identical to my husband's, but with a gentler tone. "He was going to kill you." I swallowed hard. Yes, he was. A moment of quiet passed between us. Then the creature took a step back, almost as if it was trying to let me know it wasn't a threat. I rose from the bed and looked around at the carnage, my mind spinning. I realized that in all my planning, I hadn't fully anticipated what might happen if the metamorphosis produced a conscious, free-willed entity. Are you okay?" I asked it, unsure if it had been wounded in the struggle. It nodded, or at least approximated a nod. "I feel fine. Just new. You're him," I said quietly, "but you're not him." It shook its head. "No, I'm not. That man was cruel and manipulative. I have his memories, his knowledge, but I also have something from you. Maybe your empathy or your will to survive. I'm not sure how to describe it. I let out a shaky breath. The candles were still flickering, casting dancing shadows on the blood-soaked walls. I backed away from the corpse, not wanting to look at it any more than I had to. It felt like a nightmare come to life, but the reality of my freedom began to settle in me. He was dead. He couldn't hurt me. I was still standing. The creature, this new husband, so to speak, reached out tentatively, almost like it wanted to comfort me. I didn't recoil. "What do you want?" I whispered. It glanced down at the body. "To help you to be what he should have been. To love you, if you'll let me." My mind spun. Could I ever trust this entity that wore my husband's face? Did I even have a choice? If it were truly malevolent, it probably would have attacked me already. But it hadn't. Instead, it had saved me from a horrific fate. I nodded slowly, unsure. "All right, but we need to clean this up first." It understood. Together we silently worked to bag and dispose of the remains, wiping down surfaces, scrubbing the floor. It was gruesome work, but adrenaline and a strange numbness carried me through. The creature was diligent and careful, clearly possessing my husband's knowledge of the house, the neighborhood, and how to avoid suspicion. When we finished, the place looked almost normal, save for a lingering metallic smell in the air. I woke up the next morning in a haze. My heart hammered at the memory of last night's brutality, but also at the sense of relief flooding my body. I expected to find myself alone, but then I smelled breakfast cooking. Cautiously, I padded to the kitchen, where I found the new husband. Let's call him James, for clarity's sake, wearing an apron and scrambling eggs. He glanced up at me with a soft smile. "Good morning," he said quietly. "I made breakfast. Are you hungry?" I stared, speechless. The entire scene was something out of a domestic fantasy. A loving partner cooking eggs and bacon in a sunlit kitchen, except that the sunlit kitchen had been a scene of murder the night before, and the man standing by the stove was some kind of alchemical doppelganger. "Thank you," I managed. I sat down, my hands still trembling. Part of me was braced for some hidden horror, but James just brought me a plate of food, poured me a cup of coffee, and then asked, "Are you all right? Do you want to talk?" His concern sounded genuine. I took a sip of coffee, trying to ground myself in normalcy, even though everything was far from normal. I don't know," I said. "Things happened so fast." He nodded. "I know. I have his memories, so I know how he was planning all of this for a long time. I'm sorry you had to go through that." I stared at him. "So you're not some mindless clone. You have your own thoughts." James cracked a small smile. I think the mixture you substituted contained enough of your essence to override his controlling design. I'm a mix of both of you in a sense. His body, your soul, or at least part of it. I don't feel the impulses he had, the need to dominate or hurt people, but I do feel protective toward you. And I know it must be strange for you." That was an understatement. Still, for reasons I couldn't fully articulate, I found myself breathing easier. Maybe it was because he had saved me, or maybe it was because I saw in his eyes a gentleness I had never truly seen in my husband. Even in the early days of our relationship, my husband had a certain edge, an arrogance, that this being lacked. We ate breakfast mostly in silence. My mind churned with 1,000 questions. Could the police trace anything back to us? Would friends and family wonder where my husband disappeared to? Did I want to keep living with his look-alike? But one thing at a time. First, we needed a story. My husband had apparently left for a business trip or run off with another woman, something that might explain his disappearance. I had no illusions that the neighbors wouldn't notice his absence. For now, we'd say he'd gone on an extended work assignment out of town, maybe overseas. That would buy us time. Over the next few weeks, James and I settled into an odd routine. He wore my husband's clothes, slept in the bed that once belonged to the man who tried to kill me, and accompanied me on mundane errands like shopping for groceries or picking up dry cleaning. But in every interaction I saw how different he was. He was kinder, more considerate. He'd ask for my opinion before making decisions, things my husband never did. He noticed when I was upset and gave me space or comfort depending on what I needed. He was, in short, a far better partner than my husband had ever been. I was wary at first, unsure if this was some trick, but slowly I let my guard down. Every time I expected him to snap or show the same controlling traits my husband had displayed, James did the opposite. He asked about my day. He told me I looked beautiful without a hint of the old leering or implied demands that used to accompany my husband's compliments. It felt surreal, like the man I'd always wanted my husband to be was standing right before me, wearing his face but with a completely different soul. One day I asked him, "Why do you want to stay? You could go anywhere. Start a new life without all these complications." He took my hand gently. "Because I remember everything he did to you, and it disgusts me. I want to make it right. I want to make you happy, and I care about you. Maybe it's the part of me that's you, but I feel deeply connected to you." I studied his face, the same face I once knew so intimately. Yet, behind the eyes was a different person, or perhaps an echo of who I wished my husband had been. I found myself believing him. We decided to craft a story. My husband had accepted a long-term contract job abroad. He and I had separated amicably. He'd left the house to me, deciding that traveling was his new priority. It was flimsy, but for the most part, our neighbors and a few friends seemed to buy it. Those who knew him well shrugged it off, saying he always had been impulsive. I avoided large family gatherings, not wanting to have to explain his absence to distant relatives. Occasionally, my sister would ask about him, and I'd give half-truths. She was suspicious, but I told her we'd parted ways. Privately, I knew she suspected something was off, but she also knew we'd been having trouble. She seemed content to let it lie for now. Meanwhile, James found ways to be useful around the house. He fixed leaky faucets, cooked dinner, learned how to take care of my aging car. He'd greet me at the door after work with a smile, ask me about my day, and listen, really listen, to my answers. Gradually, my nightmares about that horrible night began to fade. There was no sign of the authorities, no sign of suspicion. My biggest fear had been that some random clue, like a speck of blood we missed, would come back to haunt us. But as weeks turned into months, that fear slowly diminished. One night, as we were both curled up on the couch, he turned to me. "You know, I've been thinking. I don't have a job, obviously, but I still have all his memories, his skills. I can apply for something that he might have pursued. Maybe we can eventually move away, start fresh where nobody knows us." The idea both frightened and intrigued me. Starting over was tempting, but uprooting my entire life was a big deal. I had my career, my sister, and a handful of close friends here. Then again, this place was littered with memories. Of him. Of the near-fatal betrayal. Maybe a fresh start would do me good. "That might be nice," I said softly. "Let's consider it." He nodded, a hopeful look in his eyes. "I just want you to have a life free of the baggage he left behind." I paused, reaching out to touch his hand. "You keep using hay for the man you look like. Do you see yourself as a completely different person?" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "Yes, I share his face, but not his mind. I remember his experiences, but I don't feel them the way he did. I don't have his desires or his cruel impulses. I'm my own person." I nodded. "Then maybe you should have a new name. Or do you want to keep James?" He smiled. "You gave me that name, remember? The night all of this happened, you said it without realizing it, but I liked it. So, unless you want me to change it again, James is good." I smiled back. "James it is." As time went on, our relationship evolved. Initially, we slept in separate rooms. I was still too shaken to share a bed with the face of the man who tried to kill me. But gradually, we grew closer. He never pushed. He never insisted. He simply let me set the pace. Little by little, I found myself longing for the warmth of another body beside me at night. I started letting him stay until I fell asleep, then asked him to remain the whole night, until eventually we just shared the bedroom. The first time we were intimate, I was nervous. My mind flashed to that horrifying night, to the act that had been twisted and overshadowed by betrayal. But James was gentle. He reminded me more of my younger husband, back when we first started dating, before he became so domineering. Except better, he was considerate in ways my husband never had been. He asked what I liked, what I needed. He listened. Afterwards, I cried, not out of sadness, but out of a complex swirl of emotions. Relief, regret. The realization of what could have been had my husband not become a monster. James just held me, stroking my hair, whispering that everything was okay. In that moment, I felt something I never thought I'd feel again in this house. Safe. Of course, the specter of my husband's death and the reality of what we'd done never fully went away. There were moments when I'd wake up at night, sweaty and breathless, sure that someone was about to barge through the door. I'd dream of blood on the walls, of him rising from the dead to exact revenge on me. James would comfort me, reminding me that the threat was gone. I'd cling to him, feeling both terror and gratitude that he was there. I started therapy under the guise of marital problems. While I couldn't tell the whole truth, I spoke in vague terms about betrayal, fear, and emotional abuse. The therapist's guidance helped me process my trauma. I learned to identify my triggers and to practice self-care. I even found the courage to talk about the night I nearly died, though not in detail. James encouraged my therapy wholeheartedly. He'd drive me to appointments, wait in the car, then take me out for lunch afterwards. Slowly, he helped me see that I deserved happiness. The guilt that weighed me down for orchestrating my husband's death softened a bit, because I knew deep down he would have done far worse to me had I not intervened. It was self-defense. It was survival. Months turned into a year. We began to talk more seriously about relocating. James found remote work using my husband's credentials. He had all the passwords, the degrees, the references. It was risky, but it worked. He got a job coding for a small tech firm. The pay wasn't amazing, but it was enough. I gave notice at my job, explaining that I wanted a fresh start in a new city after my amicable separation. My boss understood, wishing me luck. We settled on a city in another state. It was large enough that we could blend in. We found a small house on the outskirts, with a garden and plenty of sunshine. Packing up was emotional. So many memories in that old house. I half expected the ghosts of my husband's final moments to appear in the living room, but they didn't. Instead, I felt a strange sense of release as we loaded boxes into the moving truck. My sister helped with the packing. She noticed James's involvement and asked quietly, "So, you and your husband's twin or something?" She was trying to be humorous, but I could tell she was concerned. "Where did you find this guy? He looks so much like—" I cut her off gently. "It's complicated. Okay, he's someone who reminds me of my ex, but isn't him, and I'm happier now. Can we leave it at that?" She studied me for a moment, then nodded. "As long as you're safe and happy, I'm good." I hugged her. "Thank you." Arriving in the new city was both exhilarating and nerve-wracking. We spent the first few weeks unpacking, furnishing the new place, and getting a feel for our new surroundings. James was careful with his identity, only providing necessary paperwork. He had enough digital proof of his credentials to keep employers from digging deeper. I realized that modern society rarely questions someone's identity if they have the right documents and accounts. My old house was sold quietly, the bank none the wiser, the buyer unsuspecting of the horrors once contained within those walls. In our new home, we established a comfortable routine. We'd wake up, share coffee, and talk about our plans for the day. He'd work from his home office while I began exploring new career opportunities. In the evenings, we'd cook together. Sometimes he'd show me new recipes, and I'd laugh at how serious he got about the tiniest details, like adjusting the heat by a single notch, or measuring spices with near scientific precision. Each evening we'd wind down with a walk through our quiet neighborhood. Sometimes I still felt a flash of panic if a car slowed down near us, images of police, sirens, accusations swirling in my mind. But it passed. Over time, the hypervigilance receded. One night, about 6 months after we moved, James and I sat on our porch, watching the sun set behind rows of suburban houses. The sky was painted in oranges and pinks, and a warm breeze ruffled my hair. I turned to look at him. Even though he looked just like my dead husband, I no longer felt that nagging fear I once did. In my heart, he was a different person, a better one. "Do you ever think about that night?" I asked quietly, sliding my hand into his. He exhaled. "Yes, it was violent, horrible, but it set us free, didn't it?" I nodded. "I still feel guilt sometimes. I know he would have killed me if I hadn't stopped him, but sometimes I wonder if there was another way." James squeezed my hand gently. "I have his memories, remember? He wouldn't have stopped. He was consumed by the idea of making you into his creation, or replacing you. He would have done unspeakable things. You saved yourself." Tears pricked at my eyes. "Yeah, I guess I did." He shifted, turning to face me fully. "You deserve peace. If you ever want to talk about it with me, I'm here. I'm not him. I'm me." I studied his face, full of earnest concern. He was right. He wasn't my husband. He had my husband's eyes, his nose, his chin, but not his cruelty, not his selfishness. In some bizarre twist of fate, I'd ended up with someone who cherished me far more than my husband ever had. Part of me still questioned how I'd come to this, but the other part, the part that had survived, was grateful. "I love you," I said softly. It was the first time I'd said it, truly said it, to him. A shiver went through him. Then he smiled, eyes glistening. I love you too, he said, voice thick with emotion. I promise I'll always take care of you. As the seasons rolled on, we continued building a life together. I found a job at a marketing firm, and he kept working remotely. We made friends in the neighborhood. A retired couple who lived across the street. A family with small kids who sometimes asked us to babysit. I caught glimpses of myself in the mirror sometimes, amazed that I could appear so normal on the outside while harboring such a dark secret. But it was my secret to keep, and I refused to let it define my new life. James suggested we take a trip, just a weekend getaway. We settled on a cozy lakeside cabin a few hours away. It would be our first real vacation together. Driving there, we held hands and played road trip games, finishing each other's sentences like a pair of newlyweds. Arriving at the cabin, we marveled at the stillness of the water, the crisp mountain air. We spent our days kayaking, fishing, and reading. Nights were spent curled up by the fireplace, a bottle of wine between us, remembering how we'd once used wine as a weapon of deception. Now it was just a simple pleasure. I never knew life could be so peaceful, I said one night. Snuggled against his chest, he kissed the top of my head. Minidain. Not that I was ever truly alive before that night. I sighed, letting the thoughts swirl around my head. He really was a new being, born from twisted circumstances. And yet here he was, giving me everything I'd ever craved. Respect, understanding, companionship, and yes, love. In the following months, I decided to reconnect with my sister more openly. I invited her to visit us in our new city. She accepted with hesitant enthusiasm. Curious about my mysterious new partner, I worried about how she'd react upon seeing him, given how much he looked like my husband. But James, for his part, handled it with grace. He prepared a wonderful meal, cracked jokes, and engaged her in conversation about her hobbies and job. By the end of the evening, she pulled me aside in the kitchen, whispering, "He's different than I expected." I swallowed. "You can say it. He looks exactly like my exer." She nodded slowly, her gaze flicking back to the living room, where James was tidying up. "Yes, but the vibe is totally different. He's actually nice, warm, not like him." I could see the concern in her eyes. "I know it's weird," I said, "but he's good to me. I'm happier now." She studied me for a long moment, then eventually gave me a small smile. "You do seem happier. If he treats you right, that's what matters, I guess." Relief washed over me. I could live with that tentative acceptance. One day, the past reared its head. I received a letter from a detective in our old city, inquiring about my husband's whereabouts. Apparently, a missing persons report had been filed by an old friend who hadn't heard from him in over a year. My heart rate spiked, and I showed the letter to James, hands trembling. We agreed that I'd respond with the story we'd concocted, that he'd left on a long-term contract and we'd lost contact. I typed out a formal letter, explaining how he'd decided to cut ties with many people, including me. I mentioned rumors that he might have gone overseas. I provided no forwarding address, feigning ignorance. It was a nerve-wracking few weeks, waiting to see if the detective would follow up. But eventually I received a reply stating that the case would remain open. But for now, there was nothing to go on. It was a relief, though I couldn't help but feel a lingering worry that one day the past might come knocking again. Despite these occasional reminders, life pressed on in our quiet suburban bubble. James and I found joy in everyday routines, cooking dinner, working on home improvement projects, hosting the neighbors for barbecues. We even got a rescue cat whom James doted on relentlessly, brushing her fur and feeding her treats. There were times I would watch him interact with that little cat, seeing the gentle way he stroked her ears, and think to myself, I never knew a man who looked like him could be so tender. Eventually, conversations about marriage popped up, though we never framed it in the traditional sense. We'd both been through something that defied normal logic, and legally we were still entangled in the lie that he was my husband who'd simply vanished. But we decided to mark our commitment in our own way. We wrote down vows to each other, promises of honesty, respect, protection, and sealed them in a small box buried under a tree in our backyard. It was symbolic, a private ceremony that meant more to me than the grand wedding I'd once had. Sometimes I asked myself if all of this was too good to be true. Could a relationship born from violence and subterfuge really flourish? The voice of my therapist urged me to let go of self-blame. It wasn't my fault that my husband had turned into a monster, nor was it my fault that in saving myself, I'd inadvertently created a new being who stepped into his life. Maybe it was cosmic irony, or maybe it was fate. Either way, it was my reality now. James and I remained vigilant, always watchful for any sign that someone might discover our secret. But as the years drifted by, it seemed more and more unlikely that anyone would lie. My husband had not been a well-liked man. He'd had few close friends, and his family lived abroad and rarely kept in touch. The world, it seemed, was all too happy to let him fade into the haze of lost acquaintances. The day I realized I was truly free from his ghost came unexpectedly. I was cleaning out old boxes in our new attic, sifting through photos and letters. I found a picture of me and my husband from our honeymoon. He looked charming, smiling broadly. But there was a coldness in his eyes I'd never fully acknowledged before. I stared at it for a long time, remembering how smitten I'd been, how I'd overlooked the small red flags that were there from day one. I took the photo down to the kitchen where James was making tea. He glanced at it, his face reflecting a strange mix of recognition and sorrow. "That was him," he said simply. I nodded. "I don't need this anymore." James understood. Without a word, he took the photo from me, tore it into pieces, and dropped them in the trash. Then he pulled me into a warm embrace. "You're free," he whispered, and in that moment, I believed it. Over the following months, I leaned into that freedom. I started painting again, a hobby I'd abandoned during my rocky marriage. I took long walks, savoring the crisp morning air, noticing details I'd once been too anxious to see. I began hosting small dinner parties, inviting neighbors and colleagues, smiling comfortably when James introduced himself as my partner. People commented on how in sync we were, how we seemed to complement each other's energies. No one suspected the truth behind our bond. James, too, seemed to flourish. He found fulfillment in his work, made friends online, picked up new skills like carpentry and gardening. He built a planter box in our backyard, and we started growing our own herbs and vegetables. Every weekend we'd harvest fresh produce, then experiment with new recipes. It was a simple, wholesome life, something I once believed only existed in daydreams. Sometimes, though, I'd remember how it all began. A threesome request, a bizarre second woman, stolen hair and lockets, a horrifying transformation. It felt like a macabre fairy tale, the kind you read about in some grim anthology. I pondered the nature of magic or science, whatever the hell that was in the book, that allowed such a transformation. Could it happen again? Were there others out there trying to mold their spouses into perfect versions? The thought chilled me, but then James would appear behind me, place his hands on my shoulders and ask softly, "You okay?" And I'd be pulled out of my dark thoughts, back into the present too. He was proof that, for all the horror, something good had come out of it, an odd sort of miracle. We never spoke about how to make the perfect wife again. I had burned that dreadful book months ago, scattering its ashes in the wind. I didn't want any trace of it left in our lives. James agreed wholeheartedly. The dangers of such a thing existing were too great. Better it remain lost and forgotten. Occasionally, I'd catch him reading some old notes or gazing at the place on his arm where a faint scar remained, the remains of the night he was born. I'd ask if he missed anything about being normal. He'd always shrug and say, "This is as normal as I want to be. I can't change what happened, but I can make the most of who I am now." Over time, my sister's guarded acceptance blossomed into genuine support. She visited more often, and on one such visit she pulled me aside. "I see how he looks at you. It's like he'd do anything for you. I never saw that in him." Her voice trembled slightly. Still uncomfortable speaking my dead husband's name, I gave her a soft smile. "He's a different man," I said, meaning it literally and metaphorically. She nodded. "I'm glad you found happiness. Just be careful." "I will," I assured her. I understood her concern. The memory of brutality still lingered in the corners of my mind. But I also knew James was a far cry from my husband. He might share a face, but he did not share a heart, or lack thereof. Years trickled by, turning the once fresh wound of my husband's betrayal into a faded scar. James and I built a life that, to an outsider, would look perfectly ordinary. We hosted holiday dinners, invited neighbors to summer barbecues, took up volunteering at a local animal shelter. The cat we adopted became our treasured pet, basking in our affection. People who met us assumed we were just another happily settled couple. Yet deep down, I never forgot what lurked beneath the surface. I never forgot how close I came to losing everything. At night, sometimes I'd lie awake with a swirl of gratitude and terror. Gratitude for Jameson's unwavering devotion. Terror at the thought of what my husband would have done if the plan had gone his way. Eventually, I found myself so at peace that I even entertained the possibility of having children, something I'd shelved years ago, back when my husband started showing his more controlling tendencies. James and I talked about it. He confessed that he wasn't sure if he was genetically capable of fathering a child, given his origin. We decided to consult a specialist, but there was no easy way to explain his physiology. Instead, we talked about adoption. "Let's adopt someday," I said. "When we're ready," he agreed, tears shining in his eyes. "I'd love that," he whispered. It was a dream for the future, and it gave me hope. Maybe one day our household would be filled with the laughter of a child, one who would never know the dark secret of how James came to be. I was okay with that. And so life went on. In my quiet moments, I'd sit on our porch, sipping tea, replaying the entire saga in my mind. From the moment my husband asked for a threesome, to Jenny's arrival, to the suspicious changes, to stumbling upon their plan, to discovering that horrid book, and finally, to orchestrating my own salvation in one violent, terrifying night. It was all behind me now, replaced by a calmer, gentler reality with James. Sometimes I wondered if I'd ever tell someone the full story. Maybe another 50 years, when I was old and gray, I'd write it down as a cautionary tale, an account of how twisted desire can lead people to do monstrous things, and how cunning can turn the tables. But for now, the secret was ours, a dark corner of my life overshadowed by the warmth and light that James brought into it. Late one evening, after we'd cleaned up dinner dishes and were sitting by the fireplace with mugs of hot cocoa, James sighed contentedly. "Remember how your husband used to obsess over everything being his way?" he asked quietly, his gaze on the dancing flames. I nodded. Yes, he was always pushing for control. James leaned his head against my shoulder. "I don't ever want you to feel controlled again. If there's anything I do that bothers you, I want you to tell me." My eyes stung with emotion. "You're nothing like him. You never were. You've given me so much freedom to be myself." He turned to face me, brushing a strand of hair from my cheek. "I'm glad, because all I want is to be with you, as you are, for as long as we both live." I leaned in, resting my forehead against his. "I want that too." In that quiet moment, I remembered the lines from that monstrous book about making a better wife, and how ironically I'd ended up with a better husband instead. Someone who took my ex's twisted plan and turned it on its head. The flames crackled, the cat purred at our feet, and all felt right in the world. This is my life now. Me and James, living in a cozy house in a peaceful neighborhood, building a future together that's as real as any love story, albeit one born from horror. He is the perfect husband, not because he's flawless, but because he respects and cherishes me in a way my original husband never did. Whenever I recall the violence of that night, I also recall the triumphant moment of my survival, the revelation that no one can truly extinguish my will to live and love on my own terms. Sometimes I think back to my mother's advice. Don't get mad, get even. I never imagined those words would become a literal fight for my life, but they did, and I emerged victorious. And if there's one thing I learned, it's that I am stronger than I ever believed, and that sometimes the universe, or magic, or coincidence, or maybe just sheer cunning, has a way of giving you a second chance at happiness. My husband wanted a threesome for his 30th birthday. What he ended up giving me instead was the opportunity to find true love, under the most bizarre circumstances imaginable. And every day I thank whatever forces led me to that outcome, because the man sitting beside me now, smiling tenderly, is more than just my husband's twin. He's the version who got all the good parts, plus a dash of my own determination. And that, I can say with certainty, is a gift worth cherishing for the rest of my life.